Hi everyone. So far we talked about different ways that we can think about politics and political science. And we went through some ideologies and concepts like power, and then we discussed rights and constitutions. And now we shift into talking about how governments operate, or at least how some government operates. And we will start that process with talking about political parties and interest groups. Those are all related to the topic of political participation, which we'll discuss more in detail next week. And they are also related to elections, which is also something that we'll focus more specifically next week. But let's start by just looking at those two groups or those two types of political participation options. So political parties, such as the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States, have a goal, and their main goal is to find candidates and then channel them or help them campaign and get elected into government positions. So in our government, some positions are appointed, especially in the executive branch, but a lot of the others are elected positions. And so the political parties are the organizations that find those people that can and want to serve on elected government positions, and then help them campaign, organize their message, and get people to vote for them. Now, we tend to think about political parties as going hand in hand with democracies. However, it is important to remember that even in non-democracies, political party, this organization that gets people, find the personalities and get them into government positions, there is still an important role for political parties in non-democracies, and especially of the kind that is not a personal dictatorship or an absolute monarchy. So if there are some groupings, some decision-making, some capability of people, even from within the elite group, to channel up into important positions, this is where we see parties play a role. Now, if you look at countries around the world, democracies and non-democracies, you see that there are some differences. We see countries like the United States and the UK, for example, that mainly have two parties. And then we see countries like Germany or the Netherlands or Switzerland that have multiple parties. Sometimes, like in the case of Switzerland, could be up to 10 parties that are all represented in the government. Now, why does the United States have only two parties and Switzerland have 7 or 8 or 9? The main reason for that is the structure of the electoral system. And we'll say a few words about it today, but mainly when we talk about elections. So it depends on how we elect our officials. And in the case of the United States, we have this system that is a winner takes it all, which tends to be translated into a two-party system. Now, each party itself can be more or less centralized. It could be that there is one head of the party that kind of tells all the candidates and party members what they should do or what policies they should advance. And they could be much more independent, or the party itself is less centralized. We also see variation in the relationships between the parties. In the United States, even where we are right now, where we can talk about highly partisanship between people and the parties seem to be very divided, there is still some sort of a consensual agreement between them. They agree to coexist. They know that if there are that there will be an opposition, they know that there will be a majority and a minority, and that they are all playing the same role in this system. But in other countries, especially if there are strong, say, communist parties or fascist parties, think about Italy, for example, you can see a party system that is much more conflictual than the one that we have in the United States, especially because parties disagree on the fundamental of the structure of the state. So we have these organizations that are political parties, and again, their main goal is to elect candidates, to find those candidates and then get them elected into government positions. Now, on this playing field of the electoral system, or government more in general, we also have interest groups. And interest groups are very interesting animals, so to speak. They don't try to elect people into government. Instead, they try to influence political outcomes. They try to have an impact on our government, on our elected officials or non-elected officials, on the bureaucracies, on the appointed officials, in order to get policies that favor whatever that interest group is standing for. So the ACLU is a very strong and well-known interest group in the United States, and it is trying to make sure that we protect voter rights, that we protect human rights more generally, and it doesn't try to directly find candidates and get them elected to government, but it does try to have impact on those elected and unelected officials once they are in office, to get policies that will favor the position of the ACLU. Interest group, you can have interest group that are formal, that you actually have to have a membership, pay dues in order to be part of them, and they can also be informal, much more loose collaboration between people with similar position and opinions. Now, what do interest groups actually do? They do a number of things. They could do direct lobbying, and in that capacity, there are representatives of those groups who meet regularly with elected officials and non-elected officials again. So meet directly with officials and tell them what they think the policy should be. And in order to kind of be heard and be valuable for those officials, interest groups can provide information and expertise and collecting knowledge and analysis that sometimes will be too time-consuming and too expensive for government officials to go after. And so with the bringing up specific information, interest groups can directly lobby and impact decision makers. They also do things like grassroots mobilization, and here the interest group will not go directly to meet with officials and tell them about the policy, but instead of that, they will raise awareness in the public, in the in grassroots, and have people act, have people send messages to their representatives in government, have the people stand up and protest or stand up and ask for certain policies. And so again, the goal is to have an influence on policy outcome, political outcome, but the means is not direct lobbying, but either through the grassroots, through the people. Interest groups do have campaign involvement. So while an interest group itself does not try to get people elected to government, they can pick and choose who they will support, and they can donate money to that party or to specific candidates that they really like. And they can have their own campaigning, their own advertising for that person or for those people. And they can also finance negative advertising, negative campaigning against those on the other side. Interest group can be involved in judicial action through amicus briefs where there is a case, and again, the sides don't want to go through weeks and months of research. They can rely on the expertise of an interest group that will come and provide a brief summarizing some information for the court. And again, interest group can and do organize protests, and protest doesn't just have to be demonstrations in the streets. If you think to the 1980s, where it was first published, or where there was a lot of noise about Nike, the company using sweatshops in developing countries, it was interest groups that organized a consumer boycott against Nike. And so this is how interest group can influence the process. Now they can do that in every country. You can see how influential interest groups are. Sometimes from the pluralism model, they are just operating, many of them, outside of the government, but trying to influence government, and do so sometimes successfully. Countries that have state autonomy have very strict rules and mainly don't allow interest groups to influence policy. There still can be active interest groups, but they're not as effective in what they're trying to do. And then finally, we have the corporatism model, where the government actually takes in the interest group and relies on them a lot more than in the pluralism model. And in that, the government also pick and chooses the winners and losers of interest group, relying on those they favor and kind of discounting the ones that they don't. So hopefully now you understand more what the difference is between political parties and interest groups. But let's look specifically on the United States, right? So in the United States, political parties tend to be broad-based. They tend to be umbrella parties, not a single issue or very narrow in scope. They have diverse membership. They are decentralized. We can see Republican candidates that think very differently on issues such as taxation, which is an important issue. So we don't have a centralized party that manages exactly what every candidate will say or do. Political parties in the United States, more than in any other countries, are focused on winning elections. And because of that, they tend to be campaign systems. They're constantly campaigning and raising funds and trying to get more officials into government. in other countries, political parties are interested in campaigns and winning elections, but also in governing. So that's one difference. And in the United States, we do have this idea that a large part of the population is independent voters, not registered to one or the other party, and that kind of pulls the political parties towards each other, towards the center, to try and win over those independent voters. Now, interest groups in the United States operate under the pluralism model. We have many of them, and they can compete fairly freely to the attention of decision makers. We have a very active field of political parties that channel money and resources to elected officials and non-elected officials all the time. We have many types of interest groups. You see issue interest groups such as environmental or human rights, but you see foreign countries that establish lobbying and act as interest groups. And we see the states of the United States in the same way lobbying decision makers in the federal government. And you can see the interest group in the United States using all of those tools that I talked about before: direct lobbying, grassroots mobilization, judicial action, protest, all of those things. Now we have to remember that we are operating some of those facts about the political parties and interest groups in the United States are because of our structural system, which is a single member plurality, or in other words, the winner takes it all. And because of that, we also tend to have a lower voter turnout. Now, I will stop here with this mini lecture, and we'll continue next time explaining that structure of the electoral system in the United States, as well as other options when we talk about elections.